53 BC. The desert swallowed an entire Roman army. 10,000 legionaries vanished into the sands of Parthia, their eagle standards lost, their general beheaded. But some survived, and when they arrived in the distant cities of the east, chained and broken, the locals witnessed something they had never seen before: the face of Rome's first true defeat. This is the story of what happened when the invincible became prisoners. May 6th, 53 BC. Carrhae, Mesopotamia, the edge of the known world. The sun rose over the desert like a bronze shield, casting long shadows across the dunes where 20,000 Roman bodies lay scattered in the sand. The Battle of Carrhae had ended not with the clash of swords but with silence. A silence so profound it seemed to swallow the wind itself. The Parthian cavalry had withdrawn at dawn, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a graveyard. Vultures circled overhead, their wings black against the pale sky. The air smelled of blood, dust, and the acrid stench of fear that had soaked into the earth. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, the conqueror of Spartacus, the triumvir who had stood beside Caesar and Pompey, was dead. His head had been severed from his body during a failed negotiation, his mouth filled with molten gold by the Parthians, in mockery of his legendary greed. His son Publius had died the day before, leading a desperate cavalry charge that ended in annihilation. The golden eagles of 7 Roman legions had been captured, dragged through the sand like trophies of a hunt. For Rome, it was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation that would echo through the centuries. But this story is not about the dead, it is about the survivors. 10,000 Roman soldiers, legionaries who had marched across the Republic's borders with the certainty of conquest, now found themselves prisoners of an empire they barely understood. They had been taught that Rome was eternal, that its legions were invincible, that the gods themselves marched in their ranks. Carrhae shattered that belief, and what followed would test not just their bodies but their very sense of identity. The Parthian Empire was not like the enemies Rome had faced before. It was not a collection of barbarian tribes or a crumbling Hellenistic kingdom. Parthia was vast, organized, and ancient. It stretched from the Euphrates River to the borders of India, a sprawling dominion of deserts, mountains, and cities that had stood for centuries before Rome was even a village on the Tiber. The Parthians were horsemen, archers who could fire arrows while riding at full gallop, warriors who had learned the art of war from the Persians and perfected it through generations of conflict. They did not fight like Romans, they did not think like Romans, and they did not treat prisoners like Romans. The captured legionaries were rounded up in the days following the battle. Parthian soldiers moved through the dunes, separating the living from the dead, binding the survivors with rope and iron. The Romans were stripped of their armor, their weapons, their dignity. Many were wounded, limping on shattered legs, clutching arms that hung useless at their sides. Others were simply exhausted, their faces blank with shock, their eyes staring at nothing. They had marched into Mesopotamia as conquerors. Now they shuffled forward as slaves. The march began on the 3rd day after the battle. The prisoners were formed into a column and driven east, away from the Euphrates, away from the borders of Rome's influence, deeper into the heart of Parthia. They walked in chains, their feet blistering on the hot sand, their throats parched under a sun that seemed to burn with personal malice. The Parthian guards rode alongside them, silent and watchful, their bows always within reach. There was no escape. The desert stretched in every direction, endless and merciless. To run was to die. Among the prisoners was a centurion named Gaius Petronius. He was 42 years old, a veteran of campaigns in Gaul and Spain, a man who had spent half his life in the legions. Carrhae had broken something inside him. Now, as he marched in chains, he felt doubt creeping in like poison. Beside him walked a younger soldier named Titus Flavius, barely 20, who had not spoken since the battle ended. He simply walked, one foot in front of the other, because there was nothing else to do. On the 5th day, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance the prisoners saw something that made them stop and stare. Green. Fields of barley and wheat, irrigated by ancient canal systems. Orchards of date palms swayed in the breeze. Villages appeared, clusters of mud brick houses where children played and women carried water jugs. It was a world untouched by war, impossibly peaceful after the horror of Carrhae. And then, on the horizon, they saw the city. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of ancient empires, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's step back into history. Ctesiphon, the jewel of Parthia. The prisoners saw it first as a shimmer on the horizon, gradually resolving into walls, towers, and the glint of water. The Tigris River curved around the city, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun. As the column drew closer, the scale became apparent. The walls were smooth, plastered surfaces decorated with glazed tiles forming geometric patterns in blues, greens, and golds. The gates were massive, flanked by towers rising higher than anything the legionaries had seen outside Rome. Above the walls, domes and arches spoke of wealth and sophistication, predating the Republic by centuries. Gaius Petronius stared and felt something twist in his chest. He had expected barbarism, mud huts, and primitive squalor that justified Roman conquest. Instead, he saw a civilization that might be older and richer than his own. They had not been defeated by savages. They had been defeated by an empire that simply fought differently, and perhaps understood war better than Rome ever had. The column halted outside the gates. Parthian officials emerged in silk robes, beards oiled and braided. They spoke rapidly to the military escort, gesturing at prisoners with casual authority. Scribes appeared with wooden tablets and began counting. The Romans were inventory. Numbers to be recorded, assets to be distributed, labor to be allocated. The process took hours while prisoners stood in chains, sweating and silent. Titus Flavius watched with wide eyes. He had never seen men like this, moving with such confidence, speaking a language like music and mathematics. In his village, the world had been simple, Romans and barbarians. But these people had cities, laws, writing, art. They had destroyed a Roman army without breaking stride. The 20-year-old felt his understanding of the world cracking. The gates opened. The streets of Ctesiphon were wide and paved, lined with brick and stone buildings. Shops displayed Chinese silk, Indian spices, Arabian incense, Egyptian glass. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasting meat, and river water. People stopped to watch. Merchants paused. Children ran alongside, pointing and laughing. Women peered from latticed windows. The locals had heard of Rome, its expansion, its brutal efficiency, its conquering legions, but they had never seen Romans like this. Defeated, chained, humiliated. The sight was unusual because Roman prisoners were different. Romans had a reputation. They were wolves of the West, people who never surrendered, who preferred death to dishonor. To see them shuffling in chains, their discipline reduced to exhausted obedience, was like watching a myth collapse. Some locals felt pity, others felt satisfaction. Rome had been expanding eastward for decades, swallowing kingdoms, pushing toward Parthia's borders. Carthage had been a message, a line in the sand. These prisoners were proof the message had been received. The column reached a large compound near the river, a walled enclosure that had been a caravanserai. Now it was a prison. Gates closed like thunder. Chains were removed. Prisoners were divided. Centurions separated from common soldiers. Wounded taken elsewhere. The rest herded into long buildings with dirt floors and no furniture. They would sleep on the ground, eat what was given, work when told. This was life now. Gaius Petronius, 42 years old, found a corner and sat heavily. His legs ached. His wrists were raw. His throat felt like sand. But worse was the mental weight. He had commanded 80 men, made life or death decisions. Now he was nothing. A prisoner surrounded by men looking for answers he did not have. He tried to remember prayers to Jupiter and Mars. The words felt hollow. The gods had not been at Carthage. Titus Flavius sat nearby, knees to chest. He thought about his father, a farmer who had worked the same land 40 years, never traveling far from their village. Titus had joined the legions to escape, to see the world, to become more. Now he was a prisoner in a city he could not pronounce, and he would probably never see his father again. He wanted to cry but was too tired, too empty. That night, prisoners received food. Flatbread, dates, thin lentil soup. Not much, but more than they had eaten in days. They ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation, too broken for hope. Then they lay on dirt floors and tried to sleep. Some succeeded. Others lay awake listening to sounds outside. Voices in unknown languages. Unfamiliar music. A call from a distant tower that would become familiar in months ahead. Gaius Petronius did not sleep. He lay thinking about Rome. Did anyone know what happened at Carthage? Had the Senate been informed? Were Caesar and Pompey planning a response? Or would Rome do nothing? Perhaps the defeat was too great. Perhaps prisoners would be forgotten, written off as casualties, names erased from history. The thought filled him with cold rage, but there was nothing he could do. He was a prisoner, and prisoners had no power. June 53rd BC, Ctesiphon, the compound by the Tigris. The first week passed in heat and uncertainty. Prisoners woke at dawn to guards shouting in Parthian. They received water and hard bread. Then they waited. Days blurred until time became meaningless. Gaius Petronius observed, a centurion's habit. He watched guards, noting routines and shifts. Professional soldiers, efficient but neither cruel nor kind. He watched prisoners too. Some withdrew into silence. Others talked constantly. A few maintained military discipline. Most simply existed, waiting for change. Titus Flavius sat in shade, staring at walls. He had stopped thinking about escape. Walls too high, guards too watchful. Beyond lay a city where he spoke no language. Beyond that, hundreds of miles of desert. He would die of thirst before reaching Roman territory. So he waited. On the 8th day, guards entered and selected prisoners. No explanation, no pattern. Young and old, healthy and wounded, officers and common soldiers chosen seemingly at random. Panic rippled through the group. Were they being taken to execution? The guards offered no answer, simply herding selected men toward the gates. Gaius Petronius was chosen. So was Titus Flavius. They marched through Ctesiphon, perhaps 200 men. Markets bustled. Craftsmen worked. Bread smelled mixed with leather and metal. Romans walked in silence, minds racing with possibilities. They reached the eastern edge where buildings gave way to open ground. Parthians were constructing something massive. Hundreds of workers hauled stones, mixed mortar, operated wooden cranes lifting limestone blocks. Overseers shouted. Engineers consulted papyrus plans. The air was thick with dust and hammer strikes. This was where Romans would work. A Parthian overseer approached. 50s weathered, scarred hands. He spoke broken Greek. Some Romans understood enough to translate. They would work on construction. They would receive food and water. They would not be mistreated if they obeyed. If they refused or caused trouble, they would be punished. The overseer did not specify punishment. He did not need to. Work began immediately. Romans divided into teams. Some hauled stones. Others mixed mortar. A few operated cranes, learning through gestures. Hard labor, but not unfamiliar. Roman soldiers built camps, dug fortifications, constructed roads. They knew stone and wood. They knew orders. So they worked. Gaius Petronius hauled stones. Each block weighed 80 pounds, carried on his shoulder from carts to masons. Sun beat down. Sweat soaked his tunic. His shoulder ached, but he kept moving one step at a time because stopping meant punishment. Around him, other Romans did the same. They did not speak or complain. They worked because work was survival. Titus Flavius mixed mortar. He stood at a trough with 3 others, mixing heavy paste with wooden paddles, arms burning. Monotonous, exhausting work that gave him something to focus on besides fear. He watched Parthian workers, noting how they moved, communicated, solved problems. Skilled laborers working with precision and efficiency. He realized he was learning techniques, methods, a trade that might keep him alive. At midday, work stopped. Prisoners received water and a meal of bread, onions, and salted fish. They sat in shade and ate in silence. Some looked broken, eyes empty. Others seemed calm, as if they had accepted their fate. Gaius Petronius ate slowly, making food last. He looked around at the construction site, at Parthian workers, at the city. This was his life now. Not a soldier, not a centurion, a laborer, a prisoner building monuments for an empire that had defeated his own. The afternoon was worse. Sun peaked, turning the site into an oven. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, dragged into shade, given water, left to recover or die. Overseers were not cruel, but not merciful. Work had to continue. The project had a schedule. Individual suffering was irrelevant. Romans learned to pace themselves, drink when offered, rest when possible. They learned to survive. When sun set, work stopped. Prisoners marched back to the compound. They walked like old men, bodies exhausted, feet dragging. Inside, they received more food and water than were left alone. Most collapsed immediately, too tired to talk. Gaius Petronius lay on the dirt floor, every muscle screaming, staring at the ceiling. This was the first day. There would be more, many more, perhaps years, perhaps the rest of his life. The thought should have filled him with despair. Instead, he felt only strange, cold clarity. He was alive. That was something. As long as he was alive, there was a chance. A chance for what, he did not know, but a chance. August 53rd BC. Ctesiphon. 2 months into captivity. The work continued. Day after day, Romans hauled stones, mixed mortar, built walls for an empire not their own. The construction site became familiar. They learned work rhythms, overseer expectations, ways to conserve energy in brutal heat. They learned which Parthian workers shared water, which ignored them, which looked at them with contempt. They learned to survive, finding small routines that gave structure to days that would otherwise blur into meaningless repetition. Gaius Petronius had changed. The 42-year-old centurion who had marched into Mesopotamia with absolute confidence was gone. In his place was a man who understood that empires were not eternal, that victories were not guaranteed. He still carried military bearing, still maintained discipline among prisoners, but something fundamental had shifted. He no longer believed in Rome's invincibility. He believed in survival, and survival meant adaptation. He began learning Parthian, not from instruction but from observation and necessity. He listened to overseers, workers, guards. He memorized words and phrases, testing them cautiously. Water, bread, stone, mortar, rest, work. Simple words that made life slightly easier. Some Romans thought he was betraying something. Gaius did not care. Language was a tool, and tools kept you alive. Titus Flavius had also changed. The 20-year-old who had joined the legion seeking glory had discovered something unexpected: skill. He was good at mixing mortar. He had developed an instinct for the right consistency, the proper ratio. Parthian workers noticed. They began showing him other techniques through gestures: how to prepare different types of mortar, how to add crushed brick for waterproofing, how to incorporate volcanic ash for strength. He absorbed it all. He did not think of it as collaboration with the enemy. He thought of it as learning a craft, and the craft gave him purpose. The two men had formed an unlikely bond: Gaius, the veteran centurion, and Titus, the young recruit. They did not talk much during work, but in evenings they would sit together and share observations. Gaius would test his Parthian vocabulary. Titus would describe construction techniques. Neither spoke about Rome, about families, about rescue or escape. Those topics led only to despair. Instead, they focused on the present, on immediate challenges, on small victories that made captivity bearable. Other prisoners were not adapting well. Some had given up entirely, performing work mechanically, eating without tasting, sleeping without dreaming. Their eyes had gone empty, spirits broken. A few had died, succumbing to heat exhaustion, disease, or loss of will. Parthians buried them without ceremony outside the city, unmarked graves for men whose names would be forgotten. Survivors learned not to dwell on the dead. Grief was a luxury they could not afford. But there were moments of unexpected humanity. A Parthian worker named Bahram, a mason in his 30s with a wife and 2 children, began sharing his midday meal with Titus, not out of pity but out of professional respect. He had noticed the young Roman's skill with mortar, his willingness to learn, his dedication. Bahram spoke no Greek and Titus spoke no Parthian, but they communicated through gestures and shared labor. The mason would demonstrate a technique, and Titus would replicate it. When Titus succeeded, Bahram would nod approval. When he failed, Bahram would patiently show him again. A small kindness in a harsh world, but it mattered. Gaius noticed the interaction and said nothing. He understood. The lines between captor and captive, between enemy and ally, were more complicated than Roman propaganda suggested. These Parthian workers were not monsters. They were craftsmen with families and lives and concerns that had nothing to do with empires or wars. They had not fought at Carrhae. They had not killed Roman soldiers. They were simply building as workers had built for thousands of years, treating Roman prisoners not as enemies, but as fellow laborers. It was a perspective that would have been impossible for Gaius to accept 2 months earlier. Now it seemed like simple truth. One evening, Gaius overheard 2 younger soldiers talking about escape. They had noticed guards were less vigilant during midday heat, that there was a section of wall that might be climbable, that if they reached the river they might steal a boat and float downstream toward Roman territory. It was a fantasy. Even if they escaped the compound and city, they would never survive the journey. But Gaius did not interrupt. He let them talk, let them plan, let them hold on to hope even if it was false. Hope was what separated the living from the dead. Later that night, lying on the dirt floor, Gaius thought about the future, not the distant future, but the immediate. Tomorrow, next week, next month. The construction project was perhaps a third complete. It would take months more, maybe a year. What would happen when finished? Would prisoners be moved to another project? Sold as slaves? Executed? Parthians had given no indication. Perhaps they had not decided. Perhaps it did not matter. Gaius realized he had stopped thinking like a Roman soldier and started thinking like a survivor. His loyalty was no longer to the Republic or the legions. It was to the men around him, to the small community of prisoners who depended on each other to endure each day. That was his duty now. Not to Rome, but to them. November 53rd, BC. Ctesiphon. 5 months into captivity. Winter came to Mesopotamia. Brutal heat gave way to cooler temperatures. Even cold nights when prisoners huddled for warmth. Work continued, but easier now. Parthians provided heavier clothing, wool tunics and cloaks. Not kindness, pragmatism. Dead workers were useless. The construction project had progressed significantly. Walls rising, foundations solid. Gaius Petronius could see what it would become. A palace or administrative complex. Something grand and permanent. Romans had built it with their own hands, creating a monument to Parthian power constructed by soldiers who had tried to conquer them. The irony was not lost on anyone. Gaius had become a foreman among prisoners. Parthian overseers had noticed his organizational skills, his ability to coordinate men. They began giving him instructions in Parthian, which he now understood well enough to translate. He assigned tasks, resolved disputes, ensured work proceeded efficiently. Not so different from being a centurion, except he was serving an empire that had defeated his own. Some prisoners resented him, seeing collaboration where he saw survival. Others were grateful. Gaius did not care. He did what needed to be done. Titus Flavius had become a skilled mason. At 20, he had learned more about construction in 5 months than most men learned in years. Bahram, the Parthian mason, had taken him on as an apprentice, teaching him stone cutting, joint fitting, principles of architecture. Titus worked alongside Bahram now, no longer as a prisoner, but as a craftsman. He took pride in his work, in the precision of his cuts, in the strength of his joints. Strange to feel pride while in captivity, but he felt it. The relationship between Titus and Bahram had evolved into something resembling friendship. They had developed a hybrid communication that allowed them to discuss complex technical matters. Bahram had invited Titus to his home one evening. Titus had met Bahram's wife, Roxana, and his 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. They had shared a meal. The children had stared at Titus with wide eyes, fascinated by the foreign soldier who worked with their father. It had been the first time in months that Titus had felt like a human being rather than a prisoner. Gaius had heard about the visit and said nothing. He understood. Prisoners were being integrated into Parthian society, not as equals but as laborers who might eventually be absorbed into the empire's workforce. A strategy more effective than chains. Give men skills, purpose, human connections, and they would stop thinking about escape. It was brilliant, and it was working. Not all prisoners were adapting. A group of about 30 men had formed what they called a resistance. They refused to learn Parthian, refused to cooperate more than minimally, refused to accept their situation. They talked constantly about Rome, about rescue, about revenge. They maintained military discipline, electing a leader, organizing as if they were still a functioning unit. Gaius watched them with sympathy and concern. He understood their need to hold on to identity, but he also knew that resistance without hope was just another form of suicide. The leader was a young Optio named Marcus Varro, 25 years old, from a minor patrician family in Rome. Educated, trained in rhetoric and philosophy as well as military tactics. He saw captivity as a moral test to be endured. To collaborate with Parthians was to betray Rome, to betray the memory of men who had died at Carthage. He gave speeches to his followers in evenings, reminding them of Roman virtue, Roman honor, Roman destiny. Some prisoners found his words inspiring. Others found them exhausting. One evening, Marcus Varro approached Gaius Petronius. The 2 men had avoided each other for months, but now Marcus had something to say. He spoke quietly. He told Gaius that his group was planning an escape. They had been observing guard rotations, studying compound walls, gathering information about city layout. They believed they could get out, reach the river, steal boats, and make it downstream to Roman territory. Dangerous, probably fatal, but better than accepting permanent captivity. Marcus wanted to know if Gaius would join them, if he would use his authority to recruit more men. Gaius listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Gaius was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, voice low and measured. He told Marcus that the plan was suicide, that even if they escaped the compound they would never survive the journey, that Parthians would hunt them down, and punishment would fall not just on those who tried but on all prisoners, that survival required adaptation, not resistance, that Rome was 1,000 miles away and might never send help, that they had to live in the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. Marcus listened, his face hardening. When Gaius finished, Marcus said that he had expected nothing else from a collaborator, from a man who had learned the enemy's language, who had accepted authority under Parthian overseers. He said that Gaius had forgotten what it meant to be Roman, that he had traded honor for comfort, that he would be remembered as a traitor if any of them ever returned home. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Gaius standing alone in the gathering darkness. Gaius watched him go and felt nothing. No anger, no shame, no regret. He had made his choice. He would keep the men under his influence alive, even if it meant collaborating, even if it meant abandoning the fantasy of rescue. Marcus Varro could pursue his doomed resistance. Gaius Petronius would pursue survival. History would judge which choice was right, but history was written by the living, and Gaius intended to be among them. December 53rd, BC. Ctesiphon, 6 months into captivity. The escape attempt came on a cold night when the moon was dark. Marcus Varro and his group of 30 men moved in silence, using stolen tools to pry loose stones from a weakened section of wall. It took 2 hours to create an opening. One by one they crawled out into darkness and disappeared into Ctesiphon streets. They made it half a mile before the alarm was raised. A Parthian patrol spotted them. Guards shouted, horns sounded. Within minutes the city was awake. Soldiers poured into streets with torches and weapons, systematically searching every alley, every building. The Romans scattered, some trying to reach the river, others attempting to hide. It was futile. They did not know the city or speak the language. By dawn, 23 of the 30 had been captured. 5 had been killed resisting. 2 had drowned in the Tigris. Marcus Varro was among those captured, taken alive after wounding one Parthian soldier with a stolen knife. The prisoners were dragged back and thrown into a separate enclosure. The rest of the Roman prisoners were assembled to watch what would happen next. The Parthian response was swift and brutal. The captured escapees were flogged in front of the assembled prisoners, 20 lashes each, delivered with leather whips that tore skin and left backs bloody. The men screamed. Some begged for mercy. Others endured in silence. Marcus Varro was flogged last. He did not scream. He stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on some distant point, body rigid with defiance even as the whip cut into his flesh. When it was over, he could barely stand. But the flogging was not the end. The Parthian commander, a stern man in his 50s named Phrades, addressed the assembled prisoners through a translator. Escape attempts would not be tolerated. Prisoners were valuable but not irreplaceable. The next group to attempt escape would be executed. And to ensure the message was understood, he would make an example. He pointed to Marcus Varro and 4 other leaders. They would be crucified outside the city walls as a warning. The execution took place the following day. 5 wooden crosses were erected on a hill visible from the compound. The condemned men were marched out under guard, hands bound, backs still bleeding. The process was slow and deliberate, designed to maximize suffering and visibility. The men were nailed to the crosses through their wrists and feet. Then the crosses were raised upright. It was a Roman method of execution, used by the Republic to punish slaves and rebels. The Parthians had learned it from their encounters with Rome and now turned it against Roman soldiers. The irony was cruel and intentional. Gaius Petronius watched from the compound. He felt no satisfaction at being proven right. He felt only deep, cold sadness. Marcus had been wrong, but he had been brave. He had held on to his principles even when they led to his death. That was worth something. Gaius turned away before the crosses were fully raised. He did not need to see the rest. He knew how crucifixion worked. He knew how long it took. He knew that Marcus Varro would hang there for hours, perhaps days, slowly suffocating, until finally, his heart gave out. It was a terrible way to die, but it was the way Marcus had chosen. Titus Flavius did not watch. He stayed inside, sitting in his corner, staring at the wall. He had known some of the men who had tried to escape. Now they were dead or dying, and for what? For honor? For principle? For the fantasy that Rome would rescue them? Titus did not understand it. He had let go of Rome months ago. He had accepted that his old life was over, that he would never see his father again. But he had also discovered that he could build a new life here, a life with purpose and skill and friendship. Marcus Varro had rejected that possibility, and now he was nailed to a cross. The executions had a profound effect on the remaining prisoners. The resistance group dissolved. The men who had followed Marcus Varro either joined the general population or withdrew into silence. No one spoke about escape anymore. No one spoke about Rome. The compound became quieter, more subdued, as if the spirit had been beaten out of it. The Parthians had achieved their goal. The prisoners were broken, not just physically but psychologically. They would work, they would obey, they would survive, but they would not resist. Gaius Petronius understood that something had changed, not just in the compound, but in himself. He had watched men die for principles he no longer believed in, and he had felt nothing. No anger, no grief, just cold, practical assessment. Marcus had made a choice. The choice had consequences. The consequences were predictable. Gaius realized he had become something different from what he had been 6 months ago. He was no longer a Roman centurion. He was no longer even a Roman soldier. He was a survivor in a foreign land, a man without a country, without allegiances, without illusions. The construction work resumed the next day. Prisoners returned to the site, hauled stones, mixed mortar, built walls. Parthian overseers said nothing about the executions. Workers said nothing. Life continued as if nothing had happened because in the grand scheme of empires and construction projects, nothing had happened. 5 men had died. Thousands died every day. Their deaths changed nothing. The walls kept rising. The palace kept taking shape. And the prisoners kept working because work was all they had left. March 56 BC. Ctesiphon, 1 year into captivity. Spring returned to Mesopotamia. The construction project was nearing completion. The palace stood as a testament to Parthian ambition and Roman labor. In another month, the work would be finished. And then the question that had haunted every prisoner would finally be answered. What would happen to them next? Gaius Petronius, now 43, had become indispensable to the Parthian overseers. He spoke their language fluently, understood their construction methods, and could manage the Roman workers efficiently. He had been given a small room, separate from the other prisoners, with a bed, a table, and a lamp. The Parthians had provided him with scrolls, technical manuals on architecture. He was no longer a prisoner in any meaningful sense. He was a foreman, a valuable asset. The transformation was complete. Titus Flavius, now 21, had also risen in status. His mastery of masonry had earned him respect from the entire crew. He was assigned to delicate work, decorative elements requiring precision. He carved stone friezes, fitted mosaics, shaped columns. His hands, once soft from farm work, were now calloused and strong. Bahram had told him that when the project finished, he would recommend Titus to other construction sites. Titus had accepted without hesitation. He had no other future. The other prisoners had settled into various states of acceptance. Some had become skilled workers. Others performed tasks mechanically, spirits broken but bodies functional. A few had died over the winter. They were buried outside the city, graves unmarked, names forgotten. The survivors did not mourn them. One evening, a Parthian official came to see Gaius. The man was well-dressed, clearly someone of rank. He introduced himself as Mithridates, an advisor to the Parthian king. He had come to discuss the future of the Roman prisoners. The construction project was nearly complete and decisions needed to be made. Mithridates explained that the Parthian Empire had use for skilled laborers. There were construction projects across the realm. The Romans who had proven themselves capable would be offered positions. They would be paid, not much but enough to live on. They would be free to move within certain designated areas, to marry if they wished, to own property within limits. They would not be citizens, but they would not be slaves either. They would be foreign workers who served the empire in exchange for security. Gaius listened without interrupting. When Mithridates finished, Gaius asked, "What about those who refused? What about those who still hoped to return to Rome?" Mithridates smiled. He said that such men were free to leave. The Parthian Empire would not hold them against their will. They could walk out of Ctesiphon tomorrow. Of course, they would receive no supplies, no money, no assistance. They would be on their own in a hostile land, hundreds of miles from Roman territory. Most would die within days, but they would be free. It was a brilliant trap. The Parthians were offering the illusion of choice while making the practical reality inescapable. Stay and work, or leave and die. It was not really a choice at all, but it allowed the empire to claim that the Romans had chosen to remain, that they had accepted Parthian authority voluntarily. Gaius asked what Mithridates wanted from him. The official said that Gaius had influence among the prisoners. He wanted Gaius to explain the offer to the other Romans, to help them understand that accepting it was not betrayal, but survival. In exchange, Gaius would be given a permanent position as a construction supervisor, with a salary, a house in the city, and the freedom to live as a resident of Ctesiphon. He would never be a citizen, but he would be comfortable, safe, alive. Gaius sat in silence for a long moment. Then he agreed. He would speak to the prisoners, explain the offer, help them understand their options, not because he believed in the Parthian Empire, not because he had forgotten Rome, but because he believed in survival, and survival meant adaptation. It meant accepting reality. It meant letting go of the past and building something new. The next day, Gaius assembled the prisoners and explained the offer. He spoke in Latin, his voice clear and steady, laying out the terms without embellishment. Some men listened with hope, seeing a chance for a new life. Others listened with despair, understanding that accepting it meant abandoning any hope of returning to Rome. A few listened with anger, seeing Gaius as a traitor. Gaius did not care. He had done what needed to be done. Titus Flavius listened from the back. When Gaius finished, Titus approached and asked what he planned to do. Gaius said that he would accept the offer, that he would stay in Ctesiphon and work for the Parthians. He asked Titus what he planned to do. Titus said that he would do the same, that he had no reason to return to Rome, no family waiting, no future there, that he had found something here, a skill and a purpose, and he would not throw it away for a country that had sent him to die in the desert. Gaius nodded. He understood. They were both survivors now, and survivors did what they had to do. May 52 BC, Ctesiphon. 14 months after Carrie, the palace was finished. The final stones had been laid, the scaffolding removed. It stood gleaming in spring sunlight, a monument to Parthian power and Roman skill. Parthian officials walked through its halls with satisfaction, inspecting the work, nodding approval. They did not thank the Roman prisoners who had built it. The prisoners were assembled one final time. Mithridates stood before them and spoke through a translator. The construction project was complete. The empire was pleased. The offer was now official. Those who wished to remain in Parthia and work for the empire would be given assignments within the week. They would receive wages, housing, and limited freedoms. Those who wished to leave were free to do so, though the empire would provide no assistance. Of the nearly 8,000 Roman prisoners who had survived the year, more than 7,000 accepted the offer. They had nowhere else to go, no resources to attempt the journey home, no reason to believe Rome would ever ransom them. They had adapted, learned skills, formed connections, and built new lives. They would stay in Parthia, not as Romans but as something else, a hybrid identity forged in defeat and survival. A few hundred refused. They were older men, mostly, veterans who could not let go of their identity as Roman soldiers. They gathered their possessions and walked out of Ctesiphon, heading west toward Roman territory. Most would die in the desert. A handful might reach Roman outposts, where they would tell their stories to disbelieving officers who would record them as curiosities and then forget them. None would ever see Rome again. Gaius Petronius watched them go with respect and pity. They were brave, holding on to principles even when those principles led to their deaths. But bravery without wisdom was foolishness. He had made his choice. He would stay. He would work. He would survive. Within a week, Gaius was assigned to a new construction project in Susa, several hundred miles east. He would supervise a team building an administrative complex. He was given a house, modest but comfortable, and a salary. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a resident of the Parthian Empire, a foreign worker with limited rights but also limited obligations. It was not the life he had imagined when he joined the legions, but it was a life. Titus Flavius was assigned to remain in Ctesiphon, working with Bahram on a new temple complex. He moved out of the compound and into a small room in the workers' quarter, near Bahram's house. He took his meals with Bahram's family, learned more Parthian, and continued to refine his skills. He was 21, and he had found a trade, a mentor, and something resembling a home. He thought about his father sometimes, wondered if the old man was still alive. He hoped so, but he did not dwell on it. That life was gone. The two men, Gaius and Titus, said goodbye on the morning Gaius left for Susa. They stood in the courtyard, now nearly empty, and shook hands in the Roman fashion. Gaius told Titus to continue learning, to master his craft, to build a life worth living. Titus told Gaius to stay safe, to remember who he was. Gaius smiled, a thin, tired smile. He said that he had already lost who he was, that the man who had marched into Mesopotamia with Crassus was dead, buried in the sands of Carrhae along with 20,000 others. The man standing here now was someone else, someone who had learned that survival mattered more than honor. Titus nodded. He understood. And then Gaius left, walking through the gates of Ctesiphon with a small group of other workers, heading east into the heart of the Parthian Empire. Titus watched him go, then turned and walked back to the construction site, where Bahram was waiting. Life continued, it always did. Rome did not forget Carrhae, but it did forget the prisoners. The Senate commissioned investigations, debated responses, and ultimately did nothing. The Republic was consumed by civil wars, by the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey, by the slow collapse of its political system. The prisoners in Parthia were a footnote, a minor tragedy in a larger story of decline. No ransom was paid. No rescue mission was launched. The men who had fought for Rome were abandoned by Rome, left to make their own way in a world that had moved on. The Battle of Carrhae became a legend, a cautionary tale about Roman arrogance and Parthian cunning. The prisoners became a footnote, mentioned briefly in histories and then forgotten. But they had lived, they had survived, they had adapted, and in doing so they had proven something that Rome in its pride had never understood, that empires rise and fall, that victories and defeats are temporary, that the only thing that endures is the human capacity to survive, to adapt, to build new lives from the ruins of old ones. The sun set over Ctesiphon, casting long shadows across the palace that Roman hands had built. The city continued its life, indifferent to the stories of the men who had labored within its walls. The Parthian Empire expanded and contracted, rose and fell, and eventually disappeared into history. But the palace remained, a testament to the skill of forgotten men, a monument to survival in a world that remembered only glory and defeat, never the quiet courage of those who simply endured. History remembers victory, but the gods remember pride, and in their triumph, both empires planted the seeds of their own ruin. The end.